Hi there, friends. Welcome. It's good to have you here. Welcome to our call. It is 7:30, so I want to begin right away as time will go quickly tonight. But welcome to our learning series here at 10th Church. My name is Dan Matheson. I'm a pastor with our 10th Kitsilano community, and I'll be hosting our learning series call here tonight. The idea behind the learning series came out of a number of discussions at 10th where it became clear that we needed some sort of a venue to talk about current social issues through the lens of Christian faith. And I'll try and invite you all, if you can, to stay muted as we go. There we go. There we go. I think we got it. And that will make it a little bit easier, as you know, if we have multiple mics on, it can make it a little bit harder to hear.
Nobody should be having a cool party that we're all not invited to.
Now, someone's having a good time. It's true. And that someone is all of us too. It's good. But over this last year with the learning series, we've covered a lot of topics around mental health and justice and oppression, the experience of being Black in the church, kids' use of social media. And tonight, we're going to explore how Christian faith relates to truth and reconciliation with Indigenous communities. And we'll do that by engaging in a learning process where we hear people's stories and ask questions. So I want to begin by acknowledging that here in Vancouver, we live on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. We want to thank them for being our hosts in this place and say that we're humbled and honored to be living on these lands today. And the format for tonight will be pretty simple. The first half, we'll be hearing from two Indigenous people, Cheryl and Mike, who will share their own experiences around truth and reconciliation and its relationship with Christian faith. And after we've heard their stories, we'll hear briefly from two non-Indigenous people who will share why they've devoted themselves to truth and reconciliation efforts. And then for the latter part of the call tonight, we'll go through a series of questions and responses with the panelists. And the sort of questions we're looking for tonight are not about debating people's experiences or trying to provoke controversy, but questions that will help us better enter into a dialogue together. So as we move through the evening, you can send a private message to Danielle. Danielle, if you want to do a little wave in the chat box there. If you see Danielle's little name in the chat box, you can send her a little note. For any question that might bubble up, send her a private message and she'll try and curate all those questions that come in. And don't hold back. We're hoping that we can all be actively engaged as participants tonight. And if we can't get to everyone's question, we'll do our best to go through as many as we can. The aim for tonight isn't to offer a definitive Christian approach to reconciliation or to answer a bunch of questions, but we're here to learn from Indigenous voices, how we might pursue healing and find ways to live in good relationship together. So we've assembled a fine panel to share this here tonight. Our panel will consist of Cheryl Bear. Cheryl, if you want to give a little wave there. Cheryl is from the Natalie Wooten First Nation and has served as a band counselor for a number of years. Cheryl has traveled as a speaker and teacher to over 600 Indigenous communities in Canada and the US. She's a multi-award-winning singer-songwriter, a founding board member of the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies, and an associate professor at Regent College here in our city. So Cheryl, thanks for being here tonight. And we also have Mike McDonald. Mike, you want to give a little wave in your box there? Mike is a member of the Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. He has been specializing in Indigenous law, commercial and environmental law for 32 years. He's a former director of World Vision Canada and the Indigenous Bar Association. He's been appointed as Queen's Counsel and is currently a partner at Clark Wilson, a Vancouver law firm, where he is the chair of their Indigenous law group. And then also later on the call, we'll hear from two non-Indigenous voices who have been actively engaged with efforts around reconciliation. We'll hear from Jody Sparger. Jody, you want to give a little wave there too? Jody is a settler of Nordic and German heritage, and she has been a pastor and church planter for 27 years. Currently, she is the director of Healing at the Wounding Place, which engages people of faith communities in the work of healing and justice with Indigenous communities. And Jody was involved with the TRC back in 2015 and has spent many years working alongside under the leadership of First Nations peoples. And lastly, we'll have Rainbow Choi. Rainbow, to give a little wave there. Rainbow immigrated to Lower Mainland from Hong Kong at the age of 5, where she grew up without any awareness whatsoever of Indigenous peoples. But now she works with the Musqueam First Nation in federal negotiations. Rainbow has a Master of Arts in Peace Education with a focus on post-conflict reconciliation and a certificate in Reconciliation Studies from the First Nations University of Canada. So we've got a fine crew to lead our dialogue here tonight. And before we start, I do want to recognize that this discussion of reconciliation is a weighty and sometimes triggering topic. And if you're having a difficult time, you're of course welcome to hop off the call or to email or call myself, one of the pastors at 10th for a conversation or for prayer together. The safety of a community is often determined by its ability to hold stories of difference. So tonight we want to be able to hold the tensions we feel while also being held by Christ, and to invite Jesus to meet us in the tender places of our lives. So let me pray for us, and then we'll get going. Join me in prayer. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we celebrate the fact that you are with us in this conversation tonight, and we are grateful for your presence. We ask that you would be our guide and our teacher to show us how to pursue healing, how to live in right relationship, how to offer a way of love towards one another. Would you come and by your Spirit guide us into truth and reconciliation? We pray in Christ's name. Amen. We will be recording our session tonight, as probably you got the little notification as you joined the call. So you do have to leave at some point. We want to pass this along to others. You can email myself or Danielle, who will field those questions, and we'll be sure to get the recording to you later on. So as we aim to bear witness to each other's stories, Cheryl, let's start with you. And why don't you begin our conversation tonight by just sharing how this need for truth and reconciliation has intersected with your own life. So Cheryl, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dan. And it's good to see some good friends on here. Jody, Pastor Ken, and others. There's a lot of you on here. So also grateful for Mike being here as well and having another Indigenous voice. And I have a good friend from Peguis, Larry Wilson, and I've also had some of my music played on Peguis Radio. So I have a fondness in my heart for Peguis First Nation. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you as well, Mike. And Jody, not so much, but Rainbow, yes, just kidding. Just kidding, Jody. Jody's one of my dear friends. So anyway, Hadi Suanda, I'll start my way that I'm supposed to start. Hadi Suanda, Cheryl Besley, Natalie
We
Westen,
can't really hear her.
and the pronunciation
Can't hear her.
is Wuten at the end. Everybody says Wuten, and but I'm like, it's not Wuten, it's Wuten. So anyway, that's thanks for that, Dan, for that good try. And I'm grateful as well to be on Coast Salish territory, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. Beautiful people, beautiful history, and they've done so much work in the Vancouver, in the land that's now known as Vancouver, for Indigenous folks. So I'm really grateful to them and have some dear, dear friends in this community. So
Hey, Cheryl, real quickly, sorry, I think some folks are having a hard time hearing you. By any chance, do you have headphones with a microphone that we could use?
I have headphones in. You can't hear me?
Well, I think we just need to pick up the audio a little bit more.
No, I can't hear you.
That's okay. Maybe if you just try and speak loudly into the computer, we'll find a way. We can hear you. Just it's a little bit quieter, but
Okay,
the sound is still pretty good.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, let's try that.
They're out. I saw somebody nod, so I'm going to take that as a go. Before I jump in, I wanted to share with you guys a link to a Vimeo, whatever you call it, and it's an invitation to tomorrow at 2:15. Kamloops First Nation wants to invite everybody to learn how to sing one of their songs, and so if you go to that website, you can and listen to the video, then you can maybe get some more information. I don't have any more information other than that video, so sorry about that. So thank you so much for this kind invitation to talk about the truth and reconciliation and what this has meant for me as an Indigenous woman and grandmother. It's been really hard, to be completely honest. It's when I first heard the news of the 215 bodies of children that were recovered, and we've been saying recovered. Some people have been saying discovered. And we're like, no, they're not. It's not a discovery. They were, Canada was told about this 6 years ago, and the TRCs. So it's a recovery operation for us, and it's a better word to, I think, to say recovery. So when I first heard that news, and I get a lot of like Indigenous news. My news feed is filled with missing Indigenous women and men. It's filled with lots of Indigenous news because algorithms, right? So I caught the news pretty early on, and normally I'll share stuff and pass it along, but I wasn't able to share this because I know some two elders that are really close friends of mine who comment on my stories a lot, and they are residential school survivors. They went to the Kamloops residential school, and I just thought I can't share this. I don't want them, these beloved friends and elders of mine, to see that first for me and just be triggered and all of that. I thought, and so I just had this. I was just frozen again, and that's sort of my response to grief and trauma. I just freeze, fight, flight, or freeze is mine. And I think there's another one, but I forgot. So that was there was a weekend coming up after that, and on the Saturday, I was sort of disassociating. We had a family birthday party or something. My little brother and a couple of my sons and my niece and nephew and sister-in-law, and we kind of talked about it a little bit, but I just couldn't. I couldn't engage because I still needed time, and then on Sunday I had made a plan to hang out with my grandson and my son Paul's former girlfriend. Crystal, the mom, and my grandson, the legend, and I almost canceled on them because I was like, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can go out. I don't think I can, because it was just weighing so heavily on me on that Sunday. And then I thought, I'm going to hang out with them and celebrate my grandson as a victory of survival. And he's this cute little guy. His mom is from Lillooet, from um, I think the Shalath First Nation, and she's growing his hair out. And now he's got a cute little ponytail, and he's a beautiful little brown skinned baby. And he just turned 3 this past May. So just within, oh, he was turning, so we were celebrating his birthday that weekend, and the Kamloops News told us that the youngest body they had found was approximately 3. And so, uh, and that was really hard. It's still, you could hear in my voice, it's still so bloody hard. And so we went out, we hung out, and he has some trouble with speech. We discovered a few months later, or a couple months later, that he is on the spectrum for autism. And so, but that day, he was playing with another little kid, and and that little kid was like, had to go after quite a long time, maybe 20 minutes of playing together. And that other little kid about the same age waved to him goodbye, and then Legend waved goodbye. And I saw his mom like almost burst into tears, saying, "Oh my goodness, he waved," and she was so overwhelmed. And then we were goofing around later, and he waved at me, and then and she was like, "Oh my goodness, he waved at you!" And so it was a really beautiful day, even though it was tough. It was made a little bit lighter by um, beautiful people and laughter, and actually we talked about an elder who had, as soon as she had heard the news of the 215, she had to go to the hospital because she just started having all of these pains in her chest and everything else. And that was something that was also noted. There was a couple other incidents like that, and it was hard. I think for every Indigenous person, we were just shattered, and still are. And I think most of Canada, I think, are also shattered and are feeling this. Some folks for the first time, and and uh, and I'm grateful for that. I wish it would have happened differently. I wish 6 years ago, that people would have really heard, the government would have really heard the residential school survivors themselves asking for help to find these missing children. And I wish then that things had been done. Um, and instead we had this horrible lull of this many years, and then and now this news. So it's quite traumatizing, and the more that we've heard about, and now it's not even being reported. And I've just read on a site that I don't even want to say the number, because the number I read today just made me, again, it just sat on me, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is it's unbelievable. And and it's so hard that it took this kind of trauma and this kind of tragedy to make Canada sort of sit up and pay attention. And just today I got also news that the court finally, I think, stopped. I don't know exactly all the things, but the Trudeau government has been really fighting. Um, um, Maybe Jody, you could talk about this a little bit more, but the anyway, there was some good news there that the courts are decided with Indigenous children, but I don't have that. I don't have that in my notes. I just remembered that as I was talking. So my mom went to Lejac Residential School, which is just a little ways away from Notley. It's about 10 kilometers, as crow flies, I guess. And she also went to St. Joseph's at Vanderhoof, and then Prince George College in Prince George. And one of the things I asked her and she died a couple of years ago, and I have on my little table over there, I have a set of papers that are for day school scholars that I have to fill out for my mom, and I have to talk about all the abuses that she suffered there, and I have to go through that without her, and I have to go through that with all of these, thinking about all of these children. So and I'm, like I said, this is so hard, but it's good. It's good for me to be able to talk to you guys about this stuff and to tell you some of the ways that we're feeling, some of the things that we're going through, because it's so much. You know, my son has addiction issues, and my dad just recently got had some health issues and now has to have oxygen. So all of these things are just sort of pressing in, and it's like, how how did our elders survive this stuff? You know, their strength to survive this and their courage to take Canada on, to to even go through with that class action suit that took over 25 years to its completion. Many of the elders who first signed on to that passed away during those years. They didn't see the end of it. And I'm grateful for that courage, and and a lot of people think, you know, about the apology that was given to residential school survivors by then Prime Minister. They think, I mean, I think that they might think that, oh, Canada's so great. You know, one person even told me, you know what, why are we talking about the residential schools? Because I've taught about this in our history and stereotypes and Indigenous worldview, culture, values, spirituality. I've taught about this for over 25 years. And after the TRC, a couple of years later, as I was sharing about the residential school, somebody said to me, a non-Indigenous person said, why are you still talking about the residential schools? Like, we apologize for that. So it's time to just move on. Kind of the same old, it's time to get over it, is what I've heard all my life when it comes to land claims, or it comes to all of these sort of just fighting for some kind of equality. But the government didn't just give an apology because they were so, you know, such good people and they're doing the right thing and they felt bad. The apology had been, the residential school survivors had asked for an apology for over 25 years from the government. They said, you need to apologize for these schools to Indigenous residential school survivors. And they wouldn't. Because an apology, of course, leads to liability. Mike's the lawyer, not me, but that's basically why they wouldn't apologize until after the class action suit was ended. And then the TRC came along, and a lot of people, again, were kind of like, oh, look, you know, Canada's doing, you know, the right thing again. Good job, Canada. We're walking in truth and reconciliation. But it was a part of the class action suit. The residential school survivors asked for this. So the adults who, as children, experienced some of the most brutal, horrific crimes committed against children, they asked for not only truth, and no one would have thought any less of them if they only asked for truth because of what happened to them. But they asked for not only truth but also reconciliation, and that is, you know, on days where I feel like I don't even want to get out of bed. You know, I don't know if I can manage the day, and all of those feelings that I have. I think about my elders, and I think about their strength and their tenacity, and the Big Dipper also reminds me of my grandpa, and now my mom, my late mom, who just suffered so much racism and so much abuse in residential schools, and yet they survived, and they could have they we had I was not I have my struggles from my childhood, and I have memories that I've talked to Christina Dawson, who's pastor at Street Church now. She's a residential school survivor, and I said, you know, this is my memory. She was like, that's my memory from being residential school. So there were days where my mom could channel a residential school nun, and so I have all of these in my memory, and it's anyway, I forgot where I was going with that, but back to the reconciliation. I just feel like if I can walk in that reconciliation and follow their mandate, then I am honoring my elders. I'm honoring my ancestors. And people, we can kind of freak out about ancestors and all this native spirituality and everything else. And it's one of the things that the church has had a really big problem with is misinformation, stereotypes, and really bad theology. Like when it comes to Indigenous people, native land is always dark, and and more evil and native spirituality and native way of being, prayers, belief in the creator, all of that is suspicious at best or just dark and evil at worst. And I have been, I have experienced racism in the church as much as I have experienced racism in society. And good, hearted, wonderful church folks will come up to me. And one person, when I was a teenager, they came up and they asked this great big theological question. They said, "Oh, you're native, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm from Naplay." And I would never deny that I was native. I never denied that I was from Naplay, even though I know a lot of folks who, not a lot, know a lot, but I've heard of a lot of folks who have, because they would escape racism. And this was even, back in the early days when there were bounties on Indigenous folks, and they would be shot if they were native. And it was Oregon Rangers. You can Google all that stuff. But I was always really proud to be native, even though I knew that as soon as I said yes, I'm native, I'm from North, like their countenance would change, their brow would furrow, and they would get very pensive. And this happened with this person in this church who's kind of like a lay leader in the church. And as soon as I said, "Yeah, I'm from Northlake," the response was, "Oh, there's a lot of darkness in your community, isn't there?" And and I'm a kid, right? Like I'm barely 15, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, I guess so." And that was put on to me rather than, and that's the story. It's been for 500 years that misinformation has been around, and Canada loves to tell that story. It's the reason why most folks in Canada hadn't heard about the residential schools until the class action suit was won, and they didn't even hear it in 2007 when they won the suit. They heard about it in 2008 when then Prime Minister gave the apology. So that's how far behind Canada is on knowing the truth. And the learning curve for you folks who are non-Indigenous is massive. You are catching up on hundreds of years of history, and it's so. God bless you. Thank you for today. Thank you for wearing orange shirts. You know we. We talk about from orange shirts to justice, and I think that orange shirts is a really big part. We're not done with that. It's going to be years and years and years. And after the 215 were found, when I was in a mall and I saw somebody in that orange shirt, I was like, "Thank you," because it just made my heart. I knew it was a non-native person, and it made my heart really happy to hear that. And some of that bad theology is the church back in the day. You might have even heard this. You might have even heard, because I certainly did. I heard that, oh, when all the Indigenous people died of like smallpox and easily communicable diseases and brought over from Europe, and they had immunity and we didn't. When millions of our people died from these in horrible ways, from these horrible diseases, Christians said to me, "Oh, that was God's will. That was God making a way for the U.S. and for Canada." And then they would compare Canada and the U.S. to Israel and Indigenous people to like the Canaanites in the Old Testament. You may have heard that. If you haven't heard that, it has sunk into the psyche of Canada because it is such a part of the story that it's in the foundations, and you might not even realize it, but that story has been told for hundreds of years. And so to say that, that whole thing of that we're the Canaanites and white people are Israelites is it's like amazing ethnocentricity at best, and it's white church supremacy at worst. And the fact is that most Indigenous people and Indigenous communities have values that come from our stories that are far more Christian, and I see Indigenous people living those values and being far more Christian than a lot of churches and a lot of Christians. So, but these things are still happening in the church. There's still churches that, if I bring in a hand drum and I'm going to sing a prayer song in native language, there's suspicion. And there's sometimes even, there's people will say, "No, you can't do that here, that's demonic." And it's like, oh my goodness, we really have a long way to go. We're only just beginning this journey. And I talk about the land acknowledgement. I love hearing it because when I was in grade 6, the teacher said, "Hey kids, this term we're studying Indigenous and Indians in Canada." He said back then, 53. So when he said, this was way back when, and he said, we're studying, and I was excited. We were going to be talking about Native people, and there was another Native kid in class, and I was like, hey, that's us. And but the teacher said, Indians in Canada, we're studying the Hurons in Eastern Canada. And I'm like, who? I don't know them. And then immediately the teacher says, but we're pretty sure they're extinct. And so we were rendered just invisible. There was no talk of the land right below us, the Plaitlay Sané and the beautiful people there. And so that's how Canada has managed to sort of like, let's talk about this way over here that has nothing to do with us right here. So the land acknowledgement grounds us, brings us closer, but it is only the first step, but not even like yours or my first step in this journey of reconciliation. It's like a baby's first step in the lifelong journey of reconciliation. And Indigenous people, we're in this for the long haul. We're willing. I think about the unjust judge and the woman who wouldn't give up. And I don't think that I'm her. That's probably my great-great-grandchild. And that's how long we're willing to walk on this journey for justice and for truth and for reconciliation. Thanks. I'll turn it back to you, Matt. Or Dan.
Thank you, Cheryl. That's beautiful to hear how you've to honor your ancestors in this long road, and to walk with that strength, knowing that it's not going to be done anytime soon. Mike, let's go over to you to hear some of your perspectives and experiences around truth and reconciliation. What could you share about how this has met your own world of experience?
Well, first, let me say hello. Well, can you hear me all right? Okay, all right. Cheryl, it's good to see you again. I'm Brander's little pipsqueak brother. So
he's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Nice to see
you. I got my lawyer glasses on. He's got his guitar. So and thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me. I'm also coming to you from the Musqueam unceded and unsurrendered lands. We live in Musqueam, or one of the many residents here in the community. We've been here since, I think, 2007. And before that, we lived on the Tsawwassen Nation lands. So I'm a transplanted Cree from and Anishinaabe from Manitoba. I was talking to Pastor Dan. Is that what we call it, Pastor Dan? Okay, all right. I was talking to Dan because I couldn't attend the group chat to prepare for tonight. And my comment was that, well, happily pitch in and share my experience and perspective, but how can we possibly even begin to scratch the surface of what's required to be discussed about the history of Indigenous peoples and their relationship with non-Indigenous peoples since the time of contact or European contact, and the impact of colonialism, the impact of a wrong theology, as Cheryl very rightly described, and the racist harm that's embedded within that theology, which includes this wrong notion of terra nullius, which started from the church and not from some lawyer's desk. And so how can you begin to discuss it in residential school and Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title and Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge, and to get into even concepts of reconciliation and truth telling? It's impossible. And so where do you start? And so, what I want to do is go back to just first principles, like kindergarten, in this particular area, and then I'll do that, and then very briefly, and it's intentional. It's not by accident, because honestly, you don't know what you don't know. You really don't. And I'm sorry to say, um, and maybe that's not appropriate to say in the world of social media, but I happen to believe that that is true for many, many people, particularly people within the evangelical church. So let's just start with first principles. Concepts around reconciliation are not unfamiliar to Christians who have read the New Testament and heard the phrase reconciliation in terms of our relationship with God and the role of Christ and the role of the gospel in that reconciliation. And talks about reconciliation not just with God, but with others, other human beings. And talks a lot about, particularly Paul's gospel, talk a lot about reconciliation requiring relationships. Like, you can't have reconciliation without a relationship. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff, but I feel like I have to say it. I don't know how many people I've known over the years saying, well, I don't know any Aboriginal people. I grew up and seeing them kind of on the side of the street, looks like they're having a hard time, or I didn't go to, there was only one Aboriginal family in my church or in my school, or I sort of knew them. I didn't really get to know anyone. And never mind having relationships. And so the efforts of colonialism have been pretty good, because they've separated Indigenous people from non-Indigenous people, particularly in the evangelical church. So reconciliation can't occur without some kind of relationship. So how are you going to get to that? Well, you can't have a relationship if you don't get to know each other. And how are we going to build on reconciliation unless you have relationships where there's people knowing people? And one of the significant aspects to what church is community. It's relationships and people living in community, in relationships with each other. And that's something that is like a hole in the church if it doesn't include Canada's First Peoples who live among us, who are our neighbors. So, now that doesn't mean just church attendance. That just means getting to know other Indigenous people. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is, especially in relation to what Cheryl talked about with residential school and the significant hurt and pain and wrongs that have happened. And you can't get to reconciliation and healing relationships without talking about truth and justice. God is a righteous God. Our relationship with God requires a certain amount of, ultimate justice and ultimate grace. And it's not like Romans said, yeah, well, you're okay. I mean, you did some bad stuff, but I still love you. Don't worry about it. No, we're pretty awful as human beings in our hearts. It's a scary place to look at sometimes, but for the immense, immeasurable grace that's poured out to us. But we need to look at our own hearts. And when we look at the history of Indigenous peoples and the hurt and the pain, we're looking at our own hearts collectively as Canadians. And that's not a pretty thing to look at. You know, when you're by yourself and you know things you've done or not done, and then you look at it and say, well, I, as a Canadian, do I share some of that responsibility? Well, if you read the Bible, the answer is yes. There is such a thing as corporate responsibility. And if you disagree with me, you better read your Bible some more. Or maybe go and listen to what Cheryl at one of her lectures at Region. So now the reason I'm talking about this truth telling being an absolutely essential aspect of reconciliation is that it requires listening and true learning and hearing. And I think this is where our faith needs to empower our ability to listen and to learn from what we're hearing. And this is where the power of the Holy Spirit needs to move in our approach to sitting down with Indigenous peoples and listening. You know, when I was on the board of World Vision Canada, we had the saying, and I probably still say it. You know, one of the early founders of World Vision said, I want my heart, I have a hard time saying this every time I say it, let my heart be broken by the things that touch the heart of God. Now, if we can't have our hearts be absolutely wounded and broken by just sitting down and listening to these stories, then we don't have the heart of God in us to truly listen and be hurt and broken by this. But we all suffer. That's one of the guarantees you get, you know, when you suffer. We all have our hearts broken. You know, we've all gone through COVID and suffered from mental health and depression and anxiety or isolation. We've lost friends, we lost family, some of us. You know, people have health issues. Mental health's become a big, big issue in the last number of years. And if our hearts have been broken by the things we've been through, that should inform us and make our hearts that much more tender when we listen to Indigenous brothers, sisters, friends talk about their experience and how hard it was, and it is sometimes even to open your CBC app and read the news. And so, and I was talking to Dan earlier, when we are listening to each other share our pain and hardship, and aren't we doing what is intended to bear up other people's pain and hurt, to share burdens? When we're sharing our suffering and pain and our hearts that are broken, that's where the Spirit of God is. Isn't that part of building community and part of creating those relationships that God intends for us? Isn't that the result of, shouldn't that be the result of truth telling? And, you know, I don't want someone to feel sorry for me. You know, I'm not here. I don't want anyone to help me. I don't want some non-Indigenous person to help me. Myself, my parents, my grandparents, their grandparents. I mean, my mother's a member of another First Nation in Manitoba. We've had 150 years of other people's help, and that ain't working. What I do want is I want a friend who I can trust, who at the right time when I'm hurting, I can say, hey, I'm hurting and here's why. Or I'm really, really angry and here's why. Can you hear me out? And you just bear with me. You know, don't try and fix me. Listen to my heart. You know, be mad with me, be angry with me, cry with me if you can. That's what truth telling and creating relationship and listening is about. You know, so reconciliation, first principles, are still in kindergarten here, by the way, is a relationship. And and another thing, it's a process. You know, I've been on the Aboriginal Relations Committee of World Vision Canada, and then they vaulted me up to the board, fair enough. And I've been working with the Law Society on their Truth and Reconciliation working group and assisting them on cultural competency becoming mandatory and you know, and what I'm finding is a lot of non-Indigenous people say, oh, great, Mike. Oh, that's great. Let's talk. We had a really good chat and, you know, happy to give you a hug. Okay, now what are we going to do? Like, what's the first thing we're going to do? What box are we going to check? You know, and like reconciliation. And this is how Indigenous people think, by the way. This is how they approach their worldview, their process of living. We're not box checkers, you know. I had a hard time early in my marriage with my wife because she was and still can be the queen of the list. And with the little yellow stickies and things stuck in the fridge in the list, and some things are checked off and some aren't. Reconciliation is not just a relationship, but a process of that relationship. It's a partnership and it's a team event. And it's a path that we walk together. It's what reconciliation is not. It's not one-sided. It's not something that Indigenous people are going to receive help from non-Indigenous people. In fact, that would be offensive. It's not a program or a box to be checked or a project. No, it's not a literacy project, or it's not a clean water or job skills and training project. Like, none of that stuff's reconciliation. Like that, those things are important, but it's a relationship. It's a group. It's a series of relationships. You know, when we're in the Law Society chatting as lawyers, Indigenous lawyers talking to non-Indigenous lawyers, one of my friend's colleagues, she's from a nation in the Fraser Canyon. Actually, no, she's from Vancouver Island. Sorry. She said, coined the phrase, nothing about us without us. So if we're going to do stuff relating to Indigenous people, you have to include Indigenous people, not just in what you do, but why you do it, how you do it, like the whole thing. Okay? And everyone kind of gets off track in that. Brent, Cheryl, you may remember one of the songs that Brander wrote. I haven't listened to it in years. It's called it's called Ask Me First. It's about a parade of lawyers, consultants, advisors, politicians, business people, all marching down to the band office to say what the great things they're going to do for Indigenous people, with one thing after another, and nobody asking the community itself what they need, want, and where they're coming from. And that was the point of that whole song. You know, if you ask me, you should ask me first. So, so the other thing I wanted to mention, there we go, quick fingers. So that the other thing I wanted to talk about was just my own personal experience of what happened this summer when these graves were found. And I was just looking at what it was, is right at the end of May. I just got out of a court hearing. It was pretty intense, pretty exhausted. And all of a sudden, whammo, we get this news. And then the next Monday, the managing partner of my firm was asking me, well, we got to get something out to the firm. We've got to figure out a message. How do we do this? Like, what we should do? Well, President of Law Society's chatting with me, Mike, we got to get a message out. What do we say? What do we do? And I'm talking to some of our clients, and they're trying to figure out some sort of messaging. And people are asking me my views on this and what they're seeing in the paper. But nobody asked me how I was doing. Like, nobody. It's like, if you have capacity, you're working in a non-Indigenous environment, and you have maybe some expertise or knowledge about stuff, they're happy to rely on you if you have that Indigenous perspective. But forget that Indigenous perspective comes out of an Indigenous person who suffers and is impacted by things because they're Indigenous. And I had a really hard time. You know, neither of my parents went to residential school. They both went to day school. My mother's, one of her languages, Cree. They didn't teach it to her and her siblings, but they learned it through her grandparents and through others around her. It wasn't taught to us. But what I was heavily impacted by what happened, because of the bigger, broader picture, that this isn't an aspect of the ancient history of Canada. These residential schools happened, and the intergenerational impact is happening. And many of these survivors are still alive, or if they passed away, it wasn't that long ago. And so their voice is still very, very strong. And moreover, it came about as a certain perspective of Indigenous peoples that impacted all of us, whether we went to residential school or not, from the Indigenous community. And we've all suffered our own type of harm from that. And so it made me really sad, really upset, because I started to see in more ways how myself and my family have suffered from the impacts of colonialism and efforts for assimilation. I started to really feel for a lot of my friends who are my age, who either went to residential school or day school, or their parents did. and who maybe chiefs that I've acted for, no longer chiefs, or now they're consultants or friends I went to university. I started to reach out to them because I thought, oh my goodness, I am sitting here feeling sorry for myself. And I've got these longtime friends I haven't talked to in months or years. They must be hurting. So I started reaching out to them. And then I realized that there's also other people like me that are professionals, or they're in business or whatever, and other people are reaching out to them, relying on them, asking them, how do we deal with this? Or they're looking after other Indigenous employees, caring for them to make sure that they're okay, or they're looking after their families because maybe they're, seen as having higher capacity, but nobody's asking them how they're doing. And so I organized a group of Indigenous professionals, and we had an online sharing time with an elder, a talking circle. And what came out of that for me was that I was really quite angry, and I still am, and I don't have any problem being angry about it. And it's not my job to apologize for being Indigenous. In a lot of environments, or making people feel awkward. It's not my fault for that. And at the same time, because I don't speak my language yet, or have suffered from impacts of assimilation or colonialism and feel upset about that, I have no problem with that. I'm still angry. I'm still upset, and I'm still incredibly sad. And so I have a lot of kind of mixed emotions about it. And over time, I just had to withdraw, take some time off work, and make a fire and be in front of the fire. That's kind of one of the things we do. And for healing. And so I just wanted to pass on that, on the personal note, that how that all that news impacted me to the point where eventually you almost feel numb. Right. So leading up to September 30th, it's kind of like we've already done a lot of that emotional heavy lifting, but I'm still feeling kind of numb. So I have to figure out a way for myself to go and have that space. And if I'm feeling like that, I can't imagine how other Indigenous people might be feeling. So giving people support, Indigenous people support and space to be triggered, to be hurt, to grieve, I think is incredibly important. But also to seek time and opportunity to listen and build relationships as a result. Because there's nothing that makes us better listeners than having our own hearts be broken in one way or the other. So getting back to reconciliation, let's be wounded together. Thanks.
Right. We hold that as a sacred thing. And I think what you said to heart too, that in kindergarten, you just don't know what you don't know. So we're in that process of trying to listen and learn together. I have asked two non-Indigenous people to also just share a bit from a settler's perspective of how they've invested their lives into efforts of reconciliation. So maybe Jody Sparger, let's start with you. Jody, can you share a bit of why you've steered your life into reconciliation efforts?
Sure. Let me just begin too by saying thank you to Mike and to Cheryl for the gift of your honesty and your vulnerability. which is something in non-Indigenous circles we don't always know what to do with. And so I've noticed that some cameras have gone off, and if people's shoulders have been riding up to their ears and you've stopped breathing and you feel super uncomfortable, I want to encourage you to drop your shoulders and take a breath. And actually I'll offer two things. One is that one are words from Chris Archie, who's from Secwepemc Nation, and she talks about how if you're starting to feel, when conversation gets uncomfortable, you're starting to feel things in your body, that's a good sign. When we're hungry, we feel hunger. When we're stressed, our body gets ready to respond to that stress. And those reactions are part of what are necessary for change. So don't freak out, stay in those spaces, figure out what you need in that. And then Mike, your gift of that picture of being around the fire as a way of just rooting and centering yourself, it was a gift for me after the Vancouver TRC events to be around a fire with your brother Brander, who was constantly reminding all of us to take that space and to walk on the land and to root ourselves in those ways. So thank you for that gift to all of us. As Dan said in my introduction, I am a settler. And it's important for me to say that. It's important for me to say that out loud, that my family came from Finland, from Sweden, and from Germany. All of the boys, it was my great-grandparents who came to North America. All of the boys were orphaned. All of the girls, the women, were disgraced in some fashion, and for those reasons left their home countries in pursuit of this historical and theological fiction bred by the doctrine of discovery and settler colonialism that said they could come into this empty and free land, which wasn't in fact empty at all. And it came at great cost, and we continue to live with the consequences of those costs to this day. My family displaced Lakota and Kickapoo and Cheyenne and Arapaho people south of the border of Canada. I today am with you from the territory of the Southern Paiute Nation and the Nawuvi tribe. And I'm here as an uninvited guest, though I went and brought tobacco and asked permission to be here in a good way, and was received in that way. And these are practices for me of not assuming. Whenever I cross the border between Canada and the US, I never forget my passport. Well, I sometimes forget my passport, but I don't cross under those circumstances. But learning to mark these other crossings into sovereign territories is an important part of my ongoing practice of walking out right relations in this land. Education and the color of my skin let me cross that border to come and make my home in Canada about 25 years ago. And it wasn't until 2007 that I started to see the cracks in that mythology of the Canadian story, which was a long time into my time being here. And when I first saw those cracks, saw that things weren't as I had assumed they were, because my life started to be lived alongside of Indigenous neighbors and friends, and their realities were starkly different from the experiences that I was having. And so those invisible privileges that I live with in white skin started to, you know how when you have, I was going to do this, but it's way too distracting, but you know how when you have your virtual background on and you don't actually have a green screen, and then you start to like blend into this other dimension. That's the image of what it's like what it was like for me as my life began to be impacted by my friends and my neighbors whose experiences of everything that I would have previously categorized as good was complicated and often violent, and not only not good, but destructive for their lives. I will do the homework that Cheryl asked me to do and just name that decision that was made today that came down, which is important to come down on the eve of this day of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, that it was UN Human Rights Tribunals who had brought rulings against Canada about the ways in which Canada deals with Indigenous children, both in education and in foster care systems. And those tribunal reports were very damning of Canada's behavior, and Canada has spent, and I don't know this number, but has spent significant amounts of money fighting those rulings, and has lost that today. So look that up. Globe and Mail had a really good article there. But those ways, those are not insignificant to this journey of reconciliation, even though solving each of those, thank you, Mike, for that number, solving those particular problems of oppression, right, do not make reconciliation, as Mike said, but they are necessary. There are injustices that disproportionately impact Indigenous peoples in this land, and there can't be a way of finding right and just relationship forward without addressing some of those. And part of that begins with becoming aware of those invisible realities that those of us who are non-Indigenous live with in this land to varying degrees. I do the work that I do, which is not fixing work, but is attempting to tell truth and to build bridges between communities so we can hear one another locally. We can understand what is necessary and required in particular places. I do that because of the kindness and generosity and the truth-telling of Indigenous elders, particularly Chief Bobby Joseph, who's head of Reconciliation Canada here or in Vancouver. When you're in a virtual room, it's so hard to figure out where you actually are. But after the TRC events here in Vancouver, or there in Vancouver, he asked, he said, the churches have stopped showing up in the conversations for reconciliation. That the churches knew how to show up. We showed up in mass for that walk for reconciliation, right, in 2013. But where have they gone? He said. And he said that the work of reconciliation is primarily spiritual work. He is not a person who would identify himself as with the Christian church, but recognizes this spiritual work. He said, if people who pray are not part of these conversations, then reconciliation will never happen for my grandchildren. Jody, will you help people who pray stay in this conversation? And so really my job, my work is to help us stay in complicated, difficult, uncomfortable conversations so that we might see that work of the Spirit of God that Mike laid out so powerfully of grace being made manifest as we are convicted and face the realities of our own brokenness, our woundedness, and our ability to wound and break others out of our own brokenness. And then as that love is made manifest in our lives, that justice might come, that our love would look like justice. So the words of Cornel West, who said that justice is love in public, and as I've been preparing today, thinking about all the time we spend in Zoom rooms, justice is love putting its pants on, even if you're only in the screen, and moving out in significant ways, taking shape, being incarnate in these ways, that things might change because they need to change. And the church has been frozen and paralyzed by shame, and we have forgotten some of our theological resources to face shame and to let it become a way that we actually move into the kind of people we can only be by the Spirit of God. So it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be in the conversation with each of you. Thanks.
To bridge builder and to keep the conversation moving. It's a gift. Rainbow, let's go over to you, and can you share a bit of how you've been steering your life into these efforts of reconciliation?
Sure. And I'd also like to start with a thank you to Cheryl and to Mike and to Jody for your gifts of sharing that enable me and enable us to keep humbly learning wherever we're at. So I'm joining this call tonight from Musqueam First Nation territory, a bit upstream and a bit inland from the main village site that's now the main reserve land. And as a little bit of background of my learning journey as a settler, I studied peace building after war and have worked in parts of the world with recent histories of genocide. But I may be a little bit clueless, but I didn't really piece together the ongoing impacts of colonial violence until I was working with an Indigenous community in Guatemala in 2012. And they had recently been uprooted and displaced by the wealthy Spanish landlords that kicked the community off the land because after many decades of taking over the land, the Indigenous community no longer, they're standing up against providing basically slave labor for the farm. And I maybe shouldn't have been surprised, but as in that moment it was happening right before my eyes, I was really shocked by the inhumanity and the injustice of it and the malice of the landowners. And as I was reflecting on that, I was realizing that apathy and inaction are also not all that far from deliberate malice. So over the next number of years, I worked with many other Indigenous communities internationally, and I learned a lot in the process. One thing that I'll share that stuck with me, I worked with a devout Jesuit leader that had won the Asian equivalent of the Nobel Peace Prize in Asia for his work with Indigenous education in his country of the Philippines. And like Cheryl shared, there's a bit of a Christian suspicion of Indigenous culture that's quite pervasive. And I asked him how he reconciles that. And he told me that when he comes to an Indigenous community, he feels the invitation from God to take off his shoes because he's on holy ground, as a reference to Moses standing in front of the burning bush, and to be reverent in the presence of God who is already here and has already been here long before any missionaries arrived. And in that same time working internationally, I had many encounters with Indigenous people, and many of them asked me if I was Indigenous and who are the Indigenous people where I live and what is their context and what are the challenges that they face. And sheepishly, time after time, I had no answers, and I really didn't have or make time to find any. But there was one time that I was talking with a group of Indigenous community leaders in the Philippines, when I obviously knew nothing other than the fact that I am not an Indigenous person and that I came as an immigrant settler as a child. And an elder just looked at me and said, "You're who we're afraid of. The settlers that don't even know the Indigenous people on whose land they've made their home, and much less the impact that they're having on those Indigenous communities." And that's when I realized that it's not just apathy and not inaction, but it starts with ignorance. So that was in 2017. So in 2018, I started taking some courses in Indigenous colonial history and contemporary issues in Canada. I took courses on residential school history and Aboriginal law, Indigenous perspectives, worldviews, and other courses. I've read most of the full volumes of the publicly available Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, which are huge, but they're direct quotes from survivors that are woven into themes. So before I had any Indigenous friends, I made space to listen to those truths from Indigenous voices as the least that I could do and the first thing that I could do. And I think as I've learned, I've realized some of the narratives that Cheryl was referring to, that as a Christian and as a Canadian for most of my life, I've shared in this identity of peacefulness and charitable benevolence and helping, like Mike was saying. That's both part of a national Canadian narrative and identity, and as much it is a Christian narrative and identity. And I think learning about our colonial identity and our complicity in it has made me question and begin to see not only the past truths, but how presently violence and arrogance are still embedded in our attitudes and our worldviews and our institutions and our faith, and how these still perpetuate colonial superiority and privilege. And I guess that's what they call the work of decolonization. And as a very simple example, when I witness people looking down on others that don't speak English or they speak English with an accent, I start to notice and question, why do we favor or even want to speak a colonial language perfectly colonially when we are in a place where we could maybe more rightfully be speaking Indigenous languages alongside our own mother tongues? But I think I do have hope that things are changing. I think as a country and as a collective church, we've moved from a place of outright denial of Indigenous rights and colonial efforts to erase those rights to a place, though it's sometimes reluctant and still completely insufficient, but towards recognizing those rights. So we're moving somewhat in the right direction. Over the last few years, I've been working with Musqueam First Nation, first to launch a collaborative partnership with a public college for educational initiatives that meet Musqueam's needs. And now I'm working with a team that's working with the federal government rather than against one another in court to begin having discussions on the recognition of rights and self-determination and what that means. And it is challenging, and I think it will continue to be challenging, even when there are positive steps forward, like our provincial and federal governments passing laws to align our domestic laws with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'm aware that our laws, and much less so than I think Mike will be, but I know that our laws are built on the doctrine of discovery, and it'll take a lot of work to untangle these. But I've learned, I guess, that as a Canadian, I am a treaty person, that we are all treaty people by virtue of being citizens of a country that has made treaties and agreements, and if not, we should be, with sovereign Indigenous nations that have been here for much longer than the few hundred years of history that our country has. And so as a Christian who seeks truth and justice, I want to be a part of that reconciliation in personal ways, in community, and also as a citizen of this country. And there's a lot more that I could say about the many ways that Indigenous perspectives and teachings and rich culture have broadened my own faith. But I want to be cognizant of time and respectfully make space, especially for Cheryl and Mike, who are here to share more of their perspectives. So, Haichka, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rainbow. That's so helpful to have that picture of taking off our shoes to step on holy ground. We have a lot of questions that have come through, and there's no way we're going to be able to move through all these questions tonight, but let's do our best to try and move through a few of them. First one here is a pretty candid one, maybe to you, Cheryl, to start this one off. Maybe Mike, you can also chime in here. What would be your unfiltered response? How does it feel to be asked to speak to a church about this topic of truth and reconciliation? How does that sit with you to be invited into a space like this tonight?
Well, who's going to go first?
Whoever's the oldest should go first.
I'm pretty old. I'm feeling old.
Well, yeah.
If mileage counts, then I'm the oldest by far.
You go first.
So this is an interesting question, because obviously, I mean, I've attended a lot of churches over the years, And I've been asked this question numerous times, and I've actually said no many times because, and because some of the churches that I've attended just weren't ready to listen to what I had to say. They weren't there. They did not have broken hearts. They did not have listening ears. They did not have an open mind. They didn't have that sense of community caring that I feel that 10th has. That's a factor in me attending and factor in me actually saying, yeah, I'll chip in this time. So yeah, I've been living my life as a Christian only partly inside churches for decades. I haven't been able to live as an Indigenous Christian inside a church for a long time. And it's only now happening as I'm getting a little older. And it's a two-way street. On one hand, I'm just becoming less and less apologetic about my indigeneity and how I express my faith as an Indigenous person, as a Cree person. And maybe that's a factor of getting old and cranky and not caring as much anymore. But it's also who I spend time with and the church community I'm growing in. And I'm glad that you're here, Pastor Ken, for me to hear me say it. And part of it, I guess a third one is just my wife kicking me in the rear end and saying, look, it's a two-way street. You have to make the effort. You have to be able to get yourself out there and talk about these things. But I don't know how many times I've got in trouble by my wife for attending a dinner party or an event. And many in my non-Indigenous Christian friends will ask me, oh, you do Aboriginal law. Oh, you're an Aboriginal person. You're from a First Nation. Oh, well, what do you think the solution to this land claims question is anyway? And I'll say, well, actually, that's a 4-day conversation and there's a lot of issues, yada, yada. And then I'll be interrupted and say, well, don't you just think that they should get over it, or that, don't you just think blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you obviously weren't interested in my opinion. And you have, from your perspective and experience, as close to an expert as you're going to get, and you're not taking the opportunity, like you're out. So obviously you just want to hear yourself express this opinion, and I'm not interested in hearing it. And then I'm the bad guy. So I've actually had those conversations in churches or in social events with other non-Indigenous Christians in churches that I've attended for decades. And it's hard. It's not fun. So when I'm asked to speak like this, I don't always say yes for those reasons, just being candid. But I feel that, I don't know if I feel that Spirit of God is moving in me and in a 10th. I don't know a better way to say it.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Mick. And thanks also, Jody and Rainbow, for sharing. I really appreciate you guys and your perspective and how much you not only care, but you've researched and you've done a lot of work to be where you're at. And I'm grateful. And that good allies like you two and others here are the reason that I can kind of keep going in some ways, because it gives me hope. Because like I said, I've been teaching in churches and educational, wherever anybody would invite me, I'll talk about residential schools and all of this stuff, and Indigenous worldview, culture, values, spirituality, and trying to get everybody to ditch those stereotypes and to learn some things from an Indigenous perspective. And same thing, same as you, Mike, just like years of of being gaslit by pastors, by heads of denominations, microaggressions that are kind of lobbed into the conversation. And it's like, you want to say, whoa, that was, and as Jody said, I would feel it in my body, and I would have to sort of like try to not react, and later on I'd be like, oh my goodness, that's what was happening, and it's just it's pretty tough. It's because that happens so often that I mean, once bitten, twice shy, right? You just kind of like, oh, I don't want to go back into that setting again and do that. But as I said earlier, the mandate from the Residential School Survivors, Truth and Reconciliation, I've really taken that to heart because they're um, and as Jody quoted Chief Bobby Joe, one of the most beautiful humans I've ever met, and he talks about his grandchildren, his descendants, and it's the same thing for me. That's where we have to keep thinking in the long term, and non-Indigenous folks just sort of think linearly. It's like parents, yourself, children, grandchildren when you get a little bit older for sure. But then that's maybe it, maybe great grandparents or something. But Indigenous people really think about that 7 generations. And sometimes you're in the middle, or sometimes it's the 7 before and it's the 7 after. So it's just this long. It's like an end game. So, but I feel like um, any place that I go into, if I can raise awareness a little bit, then the next Indigenous person that you guys are all gonna meet or come across, you're gonna see that person differently, and you're gonna react differently to them, and that makes me happy. That also, because I feel like I'm not like so healed, or I'm not so whatever that I can do things that nobody else can. I'm not. Where there's also this idea of this like Indigenous exceptionalism, where there's only a few Native people who are really good at stuff, and that's not true. There's so many of my cousins who could share much more eloquently than me, or my elders who could share much more eloquently than me. But anyway, I'm grateful to be invited, but also and also very aware of my own um, brokenness and my own limitations. And so I have had to, like Mike, say no to things, and say, can you talk to Jody? Can you like, I just need some backup here because this is really tough stuff. It's not if this is complex trauma and compound grief. This is my grief from one of my earliest memories are standing around a grave. When I was 4, my uncle um, Bob when I was 5, my uncle Norman. But and also so in the midst of all of that grief and the cycle of grief, and we grieve a lot because not because we're so messed up, it's because we're so connected. We have lots of family. We know all of our 1,000 cousins. But another reason why I show up to this kind of thing is because, as Mike said, nothing about us without us. And that means there has to be an Indigenous person in the room. Cannot have the Indian expert, talking about, or Indigenous expert, coming in and talking about us. And then, and that's what's been done in the past, because it's what's most comfortable for white people. It's really uncomfortable to have a Native person and saying really hard Native things about Native people. But to have somebody else come and talk about us, it just feels a little bit more like, whatever, I don't know. And it sucks for us because then things can get said that maybe aren't exactly whatever. It's not an Indigenous perspective. And when those people are getting paid honorarius to talk about us, it just kills me because some of my cousins are, just struggling, that sort of, they should be in these kind of situations rather than some Indigenous expert. So anyway, so we have to show up. We have to do this for our descendants, for our relatives, for our ancestors, ancestors and descendants. Oh, and some of you might be, the word ancestor might freak you out a little bit because, you're Christian and that word freaks Christians out a lot. And I love saying it, and I love freaking Christians out about that word because Terry LeBlanc, who's a Mi'kmaq elder, he's a really good friend. He's also teaches at Regent, but he's Mi'kmaqi from out back east. And he says, I'm going to make that word ancestor okay for you. Let's just say the great cloud of witnesses. And everybody goes, oh, it's okay now. anyway, so we have a lot more of that kind of theology we can throw around. But yeah, I'm here for all those reasons.
Well, thank you, Mike and Cheryl, because without your voices here, this wouldn't be happening. So thank you for being a part of this today. Let's keep going if we can with a few more questions, and we'll be over time a little bit. If you have to run off, by all means, that's fine, and you can get the recording later on. But there are a few more questions here that we just should touch on while it's all fresh and live here in the call. So question maybe for you, Mike. Why do you think the church has been afraid or suspicious of Indigenous culture and identity? Why is that, you think? Responses to that?
Well, it goes right to the beginning. It's from the beginning, when you read like Columbus's writings going back to England and stuff, you'll just read all that same stuff that you hear now, where we've been portrayed in the media for all of these years as either dumb or scary. And if we can be portrayed as dumb or lazy, then we don't deserve the land. And if we're scary, like a little bit militant, or God forbid, there's some kind of military thing that
Especially people growing up in evangelical churches.
God bless Zoom. But there's so one of the examples that I like to talk about is at Little Bighorn, when after Little Bighorn, and this is American stuff, but most of us know the story, and Custer's last stand, right? And afterwards, after the Indigenous folks there won, there was some dismembering of some of the bodies there of the American soldiers. And so everybody was like, oh, and that's where it's like, savages, there's savagery going on here, and this is not okay. And then the same people who read those history books and say that and go to church, and they'll hear, and now we're going to talk about King David, who killed Goliath, and we're going to celebrate this. And, King David, he killed Goliath with a stone, and then he cut off his head. So it's like, wait a second. So you're looking at this Little Bighorn, and you're calling us these names, and then you're reading your Bible, and this is this guy who you celebrate and honor, and Jesus is coming like King David. He does the same thing, and nobody bats an eye. So it's like ancient rules of war. So all of these things, they're just when you hear those comparisons, you suddenly go, oh, right. I have heard about that in the past. I have heard, and that's why those Native people are called that. But I never connected it to the Bible, and thought about it as ancient people. And you have to put fear. You have to put fear into your enemies because they're ancient people, right? But we can spiritualize David and say he was taking the very headship. Ew, gross. Like we spiritualize that stuff, but we but we probably think of David as a white guy because we have so whitewashed the Bible. Like you wouldn't even think about this as little brown David. But anyway, yeah. Anyway, Mike, over to you.
Well, I think you hit the nail right on the head, Cheryl, and I think that we've inherited, the evangelical church has inherited, it grew out of kind of offshoots of the Anglican or the Catholic kind of history, the story. We've inherited a false narrative that's been embedded into our theology that that non-Indigenous, non-Western societies, they need to benefit not just from the gospel, but the gospel expressed our way through our culture. And these poor missionaries that have been sent out over the last, I don't know how many generations, have gone to other countries not getting anywhere because they don't have that cross-cultural, intercultural competency that they might otherwise have had if they had good relationships with Indigenous peoples. And there's one story after another of things going sideways. And I studied at Bible college with the kids of these missionaries who were pretty messed up as a result, unfortunately. So, so that, so yeah, historically, if you go back far enough, the reason is political power. That's the reason. And we don't we even acknowledge it, or not even aware of it. It's embedded within like the Canadian psyche that is filtered into the church. And it's in all sorts of quiet little ways. But I think the more important question is, does it really matter why the church is afraid or suspicious of it? Does it really matter? Like, do we really have the time or energy to sit down and think and go back in the history and analyze the history, the theology, and do the church history and figure out all that stuff? I mean, so a lot of us have, and we can tell you what we think about it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Like, come on, we don't know each other. And do you know what it means to be a Cree? Does it freak you out when I pull out some sage and I light it up and I make some smoke and I smudge myself? Does it freak you out as a Christian? And if it does, why? Let's talk about it, you know? Let's not spend too much time trying to figure out why we're here. We know we're here and it's not a good spot. Let's just move on. I mean, we can spend a lot of time doing that. And there's great people like Cheryl and Terry LeBlanc and others. Richard Twist got some good books out. Jody and Rainbow, you looked at these issues. You know, we can discuss that, but I don't think that's the main point.
Super helpful. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Cheryl. Here's a big question, a bit of past and a bit of future here. Have we moved from when the TRC was first released in 2015? And what would be your hope for the Church of Vancouver or for 10th Church 7 years down the road from now? So the time it's been since the TRC was released, moving forward. Maybe Cheryl, any thoughts on that? Have we moved? And can you forecast a picture of hope 7 years ahead?
Well, just, you talk about faith as a mustard seed, and my hope is maybe a mustard seed that's been crushed with a pestle and mortar, and it's a little bit of dust. Some of it's flown away, but I still have a little bit, and that's sort of my. Thank you, Mike, for laughing. This is that's sort of my hopes. Back when the TRCs were happening, I went to a lot of them, and my heart was just shattered. I had a massive crisis of faith, and I would have walked away from the church, from God. I feel it in my bones. I would have walked away if it wasn't for the stories of my Indigenous elders. So many different places, so many different names of Creator in our old languages and stories that predate when we found Europeans on our shoreline. So that's but and I watched other people have their hearts broken as well. And back then, when there was a TRC in a town, Jody and I were talking with this educational group who we were asking, "Can you please shut down for the day?" And they said, the response from one of the main people from that crew said, "What is this? What does the TRC have to do with us?" And it was a Christian educational space, and I was just like, "Wow, that's horrible." And today that question isn't being asked anymore. Even that same institution has completely done a 180, and they're doing different things. So I do have hope. I do feel though this is such a long journey, and I hear people even today saying, "Oh man, this is always in the news. It's native stuff and native, um, they're always protesting something, or they're always, this or that. When is it going to be enough?" And then the unmarked graves, people are like, "Oh my goodness, they died of, lots of things back then." and they sort of like are, and I've heard those things, and those things really hurt me because, well, every residential school had a legit graveyard, you know, and if it's Catholic, there's real rules, like death is a sacrament. You put the fence up, you have grave. So my mom's residential school has a graveyard. I've seen it all my life. Every residential school has a marked graveyard. That's the thing a lot of people don't know. They think about these unmarked graves and they think, oh, that's really horrible. No school should have it. Well, we had regular ones because there were kids that died of those normal diseases, and they were put in those graves because they didn't want to send them home for miles and miles and miles, hundreds of miles sometimes, and so. But now, I think things have changed. I think that, you know, it felt to me like I love the word apocalypse because, well, I like dystopian futuristic movies, and I always say that, and I heard this someplace before, that we Indigenous people have been living a dystopian future since 1492. Did I get that? You're right. I always get numbers wrong. But anyway, so yeah, I have a little bit more hope because it felt like the unmarked graves being found was apocalyptic in the true sense of the word apocalypse. You know, we translate the last book of the Bible, Revelation, that the word is apocalypse, and it means revealing. It means showing the truth, and it's a powerful, beautiful word. I feel like those are the days we're living in. That God is revealing these truths, and God's justice and the prayers of our ancestors are being answered. So yeah, hope. It's like I said, it's dust, but it's building. So, and events like this help too. Like,
Thank you, Cheryl. I'd like to weigh in on this, if you don't mind. I think that Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a big statement in an official public way from a member of the Peguis First Nation, by the way, the chief commissioner, former judge, former Senator Murray Sinclair, who basically said to Indigenous people across Canada, the state you're in, the harm that you're feeling, the social disarray you might be feeling, unemployment, health impacts, the incarceration rates, the high rates of Indigenous people in care, it's not your fault. The hurt that you have, the difficulty that your communities are suffering from, it's not your fault. Here's the history of it. And it gave Indigenous people a freedom to say, you know what, I'm going to be Indigenous. Young people are learning a language again. It's cool to see younger Indigenous people speaking, learning the language. And so people are kind of embarrassed. Institutions, organizations, universities, businesses are kind of embarrassed. Oh, we got to do something. We have to say that we're responding to these calls to action. And so now more professionals, more teachers, doctors, nurses are taking courses on in the history of Indigenous people, becoming, as they say, taking this intercultural competency training, which is actually specifically identified in the TRC calls to action. Institutions, organizations, companies are developing reconciliation action plans, and they're publishing them on their website. They're making it known. They're developing engagement relationships with local Indigenous peoples. And so now it's actually becoming part of the social and economic reality in Canada. A lot of it is window dressing, fair enough. A lot of it is box checking, fair enough. But it's actually starting to happen in the Canadian fabric. And churches are behind. They're being embarrassed into having to do that, saying, hey, well, we better do that too. And so, there's a little, I hate to put it that way, but I kind of see that happening. In my practice, we develop and help our clients build these Indigenous engagement plans. We do workshops on what intercultural competency is. We line them up with the different service providers that can do this sort of training and provide that education. And we've been doing it for a number of years now. And very few churches have done that. And so in terms of hopes for the church in Vancouver, part of it is a little bit, maybe they're embarrassed about being a little bit behind. We got to get doing this because it's happening out there outside the church. So maybe we need to do something. But at the same time, it is starting to move forward. The word reconciliation is actually part of the Canadian vocabulary now. We're starting to learn more about what it means. So these are all good things. Kind of awkward to say why, but I think these are all good things.
All right, how about one final question here as we wrap up? What are some things we could do tomorrow, September 30th, to mark the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation? Any thoughts and ideas of what are ways to honor that day well? Cheryl, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think maybe probably Jody or Rainbow, maybe Mike even. I might have some ideas of events that are going on. I don't even really know. I am completely taking a day off. I had some offers to speak or to sing or do whatever. And as much as I would have liked to have done that, I just felt like I'm going to take the day completely. And if there is some events that I can go to that I feel up to, then I'm going to go to them. But it's when I said back when I heard about the 215, and I disassociated, and it took until that Monday when somebody was like, just like, take the day. And so, and I spent Monday just crying and being very angry and talking to God, like the Psalms. Eugene Peterson said that the Psalms are proof that God allows us to be human. And so I was very Psalmsy that day. And like Mike, I love that you said that you're angry and that you feel this, because it's very human to do that. And so I'm going to have some very human emotions tomorrow. I'm going to hopefully get to hang out with my grandson and my sons, and just do some healing, because as has been shared, we still very much live with the realities of the legacy of these, the horrific legacies of these schools. So yeah, I'm gonna be grieving tomorrow.
Things that are going on in our area tomorrow.
Go ahead, Judy.
No, you go ahead, Remo.
I'm going to be at Musqueam. There's an event there. I don't actually know if it's public, but someone just texted me and told me that they found it online. But there is something happening at Musqueam. You can find it online. It's probably public. Another thing that I might suggest is if you do have a paid day off, maybe you might consider donating that wage that you have now been given for free for that day to something that supports Indigenous something. And people have asked me, well, which organization should I give to? I suggest to people to learn a bit about the impacts of residential school, which are so broad. And if there's a piece of it that you feel more strongly about, then find an organization that is working in that area, whether it's healing or trauma or education or arts or language revitalization. There's so many aspects of the impacts of residential schools. And if there's something that you feel strongly about, and want to know more about, then be a part of it through supporting organizations.
We'll get the shameless promotion out of the way. We're hosting something tomorrow. And you can go to redclover.ca and get the Eventbrite link for that. But it's an opportunity to practice lamenting, to reflect theologically, and to hear from survivors. In our case, we're using some recordings because, as Cheryl highlighted, it can be a quadruple burden sometimes to be asking, to assume that we have the right to hear those stories, particularly when there's been lots of work recording those stories and giving people space on this day as well. So yeah, recommend that. Also, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has a whole week's worth of programming that I'd recommend you check out their programming. There's lots of stuff for various ages. People are wanting to do stuff with their kids. If you have kids, sit down with your kids and ask them what they're already learning. They probably know way more than you have any idea about. And for them both to give, for you to honor them and their learning and practice some good learning in that way is really a good way to mark that day as well. I had one other thing. I always have lots of options. Feel free to text me or email me.
The day tomorrow, or ways that we could also mark it?
Yeah, I'm actually just popping up a memo that our group and we put together as a message to everybody in our firms. Firm's got 100 lawyers and almost 200 staff, so we're trying to provide some resources to people just how to mark the day. Really, it's a personal choice, obviously. And what I'll do is I will forward this memo to you, Dan, after this call. I'm just not able to do it now, but there's the National Day for Reconciliation. There's an Orange Shirt Day Society website. Have a look at that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission final reports, something worth reading. And it takes a long time to read it, but maybe take a start at it, or maybe read their executive summary and the actual 92 calls to action, or 94. And then maybe the progress on realizing that. And in terms of residential schools, that is a tough one. It's heavy lifting, but there's the Residential School History and Dialogue Center. The Assembly of First Nations has an education toolkit called It's Our Time. There's some educational resources from UBC that's on their website. BCIT has a free course online on Indigenous people. It's about a 4-hour program. University of Alberta's got a 25-hour course on Indigenous peoples in history, and that's free. And there's other media out there. There's 35 books to read for National Indigenous History Month. Have a look at that list, pick a book. There's podcasts. There's a whole bunch of stuff. There's a lot of in-person things going on in the city. There's Orange Shirt Day at Grandview Park and an intergenerational march at UBC. There's an SFU's got something going on, the Spirit of Children's Society pipe ceremony, and there's some virtual events as well. So I'll flip this memo to you, Dan.
Sounds great.
It's a bit of a resource, and it's something if I'd known that question was coming up, I would have been able to respond a bit sooner on it. But there's literally hundreds of things to do.
Yeah.
From a faith perspective, and Jody, thank you so much for just taking the time to think and grieve and pray. That's important, because I think an awful lot about the book of Nehemiah, and that's a situation where Nehemiah rebuilt a wall. You know, he didn't preach repentance like Jonah or John the Baptist. He he was called to go and build a wall. Doesn't sound very spiritual. But in doing so, he helped rebuild a nation. And if we're going to do reconciliation, we need to think about nation rebuilding and partnering with Indigenous people to help grow and build and rebuild their identities, their cultures. But we can't do that unless we take his example in what he did. You know, when he first heard the news from a relative, he wept and he prayed and he mourned in sackcloth and ashes for a long time. And when he heard the news about how bad it was and how the walls of the city were broken down, and then he thought of a plan and he prayed about this plan. And he said, God, give me some help. I'm talking to the boss here for permission to go and do this. And so it all starts with this grieving. And grieving, I think, and weeping, as you mentioned, Jody, that's a form of prayer. That is a spiritual exercise that you mentioned, you know. And we should all do it in our own way. But unless we can truly be impacted by that, I don't know if much will change. And sometimes it means reading reading stuff that's really hard to read, or listening to things that's really hard to hear before our hearts are broken that way. So I would say read the first chapter of the book of Nehemiah and think about that, and think about how Indigenous peoples read that chapter.
Great, thanks, Mike. Mike and Cheryl, Jody Rainbow have all compiled a recommended resource page. Maybe Dan, if you're going to post it in the chat here. If you scroll down to the bottom of this page, there's a PDF document that has a bunch of Cheryl's poems and songs. There's lots of books to read. There's articles, TV shows, films to watch. It's a great resource page. You could be on that page for a few weeks and not exhaust it. But it'd be a really helpful toolkit with some materials there for kids as well. So check that out. And thanks to Mike and Cheryl Raymond Joy for putting that list of materials together. There is a long road ahead, and we want to walk it together. And in life of faith, we want to be led forward, as we've said here, with prayer. So why don't we end tonight by praying together? Let's do so by praying silently for 1 minute, asking God for his wisdom and his spirit to lead us. We don't want to pray to kind of wrap this up, but to unwrap it and ask that God would bring to mind something that each of us could take with us from here. So let's pray in silence for 1 minute together, and then I'll say amen to conclude our time. Let's pray. Well, amen. Thanks again for everyone for being here tonight, and special thanks to our panel. Thank you, Cheryl and Mike and Rainbow and Jody. Your voices here have been such a gift to us, and these spaces help sharpen our learning. So we're so grateful for you and for your input. And together we trust Christ's light to to lead us on the road ahead. So good night, friends. Thanks for being here, and until next time, we'll see you.